Hello and welcome back to the next episode, the latest episode of the Homegrown Podcast. As we mentioned in our previous episodes, this is really an attempt to bring some people and some sources to our community, our rich history here in Webster and central Massachusetts. And this episode is brought to you by the THC Group, which is my consulting firm relative to regulated industries. So every time we have an episode, our goal is to uncover the hidden gems that we might have here in our community and foster some connection throughout our community, our town, and our region. And today's episode is certainly one that we're happy to host and one that we are sure you will not want to miss. So by all means, grab a coffee, settle in, and let's join our growing community of listeners here. Also, by the way, you can subscribe on Spotify, Apple Music, or YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. By all means, please do subscribe. So we're thrilled today to welcome someone who I respect, someone who I've come to respect throughout my career, a true community leader here in Webster, which is Webster Police Chief Michael Shaw. Chief Shaw has about 3 decades or so of serving our town here in Webster, starting in 1997, including his most recent rise to police chief in 2019. His journey is one that certainly is remarkable compared to any law enforcement career. He's a U.S. Marine Corps Reserve veteran and an FBI National Academy graduate, and we'll talk more about that as we get underway. And obviously, locally, he's shaped public safety here in our community with both his experience as well as his vision. So the goal today is to dive as deep as possible into his career, his philosophies, and his approach to law enforcement and policing, the evolving face of policing here in Webster, but also we're going to try to zoom out a little bit and look at our region, look at our state, and look at our nation as well. So Chief Shaw, thank you, of course, for joining us today. It's an honor to have you here. Before we get started, I do want to at least make a disclosure for folks. My brother, Josh Collins, is a police officer here in Webster as well, and obviously therefore serves under Chief Shaw's command. So that's not something that's really going to influence our discussion today at all, but I think just for the sake of transparency, it's important to acknowledge. And also, just as a proud brother, I'm grateful to have my brother serving my community and serving me and my family in a law enforcement capacity. So damn proud of him, but also just felt like that was an important disclosure to make. So Chief, again, thank you for joining us. I guess I'll start if we'll jump right into it. You started here in Webster in 1997 in law enforcement. You obviously had a military career prior. Is there something in particular or a perspective in your life that drew you to law enforcement in particular as a career? And obviously, has that perspective evolved throughout your tenure and your career here in Webster?
Yeah, so thank you for having me, and thank you very much for those kind words. I greatly appreciate it.
Of course.
Yeah, so it's my path to get here is kind of a funny one. I was a single child, with a single parent household. My mother was a school teacher. She retired from the district up in Shirley. She was an elementary school teacher for 35 years or so. So I was actually in school. I was going to Fitchburg State to be a teacher. I was an English major, and I was going to be a teacher there. And at some point during that my freshman year, kind of had the epiphany and decided that I wanted to get into law enforcement. And at that same time, I wanted to try to better myself for this career, and always had an interest in the military, and wanted to join. I was looking at the Army and the Marines at that point in time, and that's a funny story for another time, and how I ended up. The recruiter was very tenacious, let's put it that way. But I ended up joining the Marine Corps Reserves, and at the same time, I decided to become law enforcement. I wanted to go to a college that had a criminal justice degree, and Anna Maria at the time was the only school around that had one, so I had to transfer schools. So the trade-off I had talking to my mother about it was she really, being an educator, she wanted me to finish college. So I was going to go full-time into the Marines, but we had a trade-off where I would go in the reserves and finish my career. And there was a talk of, if the law enforcement thing didn't work out, maybe going then full-time into the Marine Corps. But obviously the path kind of led me down here. So I ended up in Webster, and it's funny. We had settled. I'd moved around a lot when I was a kid, so I was up northern Worcester County, Fitchburg, Leominster area. Lived in a bunch of different places. Settled in Shrewsbury when I was in the 8th grade. Went to St. John's, and took the civil service test. I had an interview with Shrewsbury PD when I was like 21. Went to sign the civil service list when I got a card. Back then, you would get a card in the mail. You go down and sign the list at the town hall, and that segued into an interview, which I was totally not prepared for, since I was wearing my acid wash jeans and an AC/DC shirt because I had just come from working at the Big D supermarket. Didn't get the job, to say the least, but it was actually very eye opening to me, and just affirmed that this is what I wanted to do. So when you take the civil service test back then, you could pick off several different towns that you could work in. Webster didn't have a residence preference, so I picked Webster. Had no idea where it was. Dated a girl from Nichols when I was at Anna Maria, and came. I think we went to McDonald's and Dudley House of Pizza for a couple of dates, and then that was really about it. Ended up signing here as a part-time patrolman. Went to the part-time academy in '96, and then I ended up full-time in '97, and I've been here ever since.
Yep. Do you think since 1997, maybe outside of the acid-washed jeans,
Thank God.
In so many ways, the world has come back around too. But I think the question more so is sort of the evolution of things. I mean, I think 1997 feels like yesterday to some of us, and I think for some it feels like forever ago. And I think about sort of just the optics of policing and sort of the optics of law enforcement. I remember police cars versus police SUVs, and sort of just the sort of the visual effect of law enforcement's changed. But I'm sure a lot has changed during your tenure. And also, you've climbed the ranks progressively. Patrolman to all the sergeant, lieutenant, deputy chief, etc. How, this is a loaded question, maybe we'll generate some more discussion, but are there any sort of dramatic ways that you think policing has changed in that time frame, or are there things that maybe it's just some subtle changes that we may not see on the public side? And obviously, I think your roles too, as they've increased, have brought on, I'm sure, more bureaucracy and more behind the scenes administrative tasks. But how has policing evolved or changed throughout that tenure of yours?
Policing, especially, I think here in Webster, it's changed dramatically since 1997. The practices that had gone on here prior to my becoming employed here. Oops, I did something. Prior to my coming here, and then to where they are now, it's night and day. It's a complete and total 180. I would say it was very rudimentary back then. We had an administration that didn't believe in certain, wouldn't let us carry batons. Just was very set in certain ways of policing and believed in a certain style of policing, which there was no accountability. Let's put it that way. It was run kind of like a country club. And unfortunately, that resulted in some really, really hard times here in the late 90s and even early 2000s, not to get into the history, but it was one of those things that it was a tough time to be a police officer here in Webster. And there's not many of us left that were here then. I think there's only really 3 of us. But it was in a strange way, I'm glad I went through it, because I know what it was like, and I never want to let it get back to the way it was. So I think it helped shape me in some of my philosophies going up and moving up through the ranks. We did the community policing stuff back then, not like we did now, but we didn't. I think that Webster has now become a lot more professional as a police department than it was in 1997, 100%. And I think that's the big takeaway on that.
That's a good point, because this is more of a sort of a zoom forward to recent, but I think you think about the advent and sort of the introduction now of technology in policing, and I think some of it is very visible, such as like a body camera and sort of that activity. And obviously, I'd love to talk more about sort of the rise of sort of the citizen engagement on that police officers are now on the receiving end of as well, which is the job itself has changed dramatically in what you and your officers confront on a daily basis. But also, the professionalism point is, it is a professional operation, right? Like you have a lot of technology, and as an attorney myself, I think about things like evidence and chain of custody and sort of how you build a case. And, I think Webster in particular is as of recent, and I also want to commend you and love to talk more about sort of the social media engagement that you and the department do, is you tell those stories, and I think you tell them well, of how cases get built, how long investigations take, how long your officers and your detectives, but also the collaboration you have with federal partners. And that professionalism, I think, is something that it's easy to sort of ignore or overlook or pass over. But I think the more you dig into it, you realize just how intense and how, and I, my history in the Cannabis Control Commission previously, we had to build relationships with partners all over the state and all over the country. And what helped with that was credibility and the ability to say to a peer in the FBI or in the DEA or in the U.S. Attorney's Office, take us seriously because we take ourselves and our work seriously as well. And so I think, I think about, I saw a recent post of yours about, is there a drone division now or sort of?
Yes, we just started a drone. We have a drone unit.
Yeah. And I think, again, like you think about modern technology and how it can be adapted and deployed into policing. But it makes me wonder, I think of a community like Webster as being suburban and, we think about, we have the luxury of the lake and sort of all these. At the same time, there's a side of a community that people don't always see or engage with. And I think you and your officers sort of protect us from that side of a community as well. And so sometimes the things we may not see, we may not appreciate either. So, I think about, how does policing in Webster compare to, say, what we might see on the nightly news in Boston or New York or Chicago, and some of these more what feels like crime-ridden cities and or jurisdictions. Webster doesn't feel that way, but again, I think it's got this mix of suburban and rural vibes to it. And how does policing differ here versus somewhere else, perhaps?
So I think there's a couple of ways we can answer this. Two answers for this one, two parts. I think the first part is like to regards when you talk about the big cities, and I'm not trying to say like they don't have, they have, it's a much larger agency. I mean, New York City PD is I think 30,000 cops, I think, or something. Boston's, thousands of officers. Right. So it's hard to have that engagement, that connection with your community. We have 33. Hopefully we'll be able to expand next year with in the upcoming fiscal year, by a couple more. But we're able to have, because we're a small enough community that we can know our community. We have that credibility because we're out there and we're able to connect with them. The folks on the on the suburban side, if you will, and the folks on the urban side, like we have those connections where we have that credibility. We don't always maybe see eye to eye with certain issues, or we still have a job to do. But I think at the end of the day, the Webster Police Department has credibility with the majority of our stakeholders. And by stakeholders, I mean our entire community, our entire business population, everybody. Like we do, I think we do a very good job of trying to connect with them and being transparent, in showing what we do, why we do it, and explaining showing what we deal with. And the other part was like some of the things that we deal with. It's interesting because Webster's a very unique. You hit the nail on the head. There's a lot of people out there that don't have an idea as to what we deal with, and with our social media, we try to show some of that. I can't show it all, but there's a lot of things that the officers deal with here that are very similar that they deal with in New York and in Boston. The crime laden communities, if you will. Yeah. We have a gang issue here. We have a gang problem because of our connection to Worcester. We have an influx of gang folks that they aren't necessarily maybe committing crimes here, but they're here. They're coming right here and they're laying their heads. We're not seeing the activity that they might be seeing in Worcester, but they are here and they've been here. And we're aware of that. And, we work with our partners in Worcester and our other state agencies, federal agencies, to share information and network on that. So we have a great relationship with those folks. But Webster's, I always describe it as a small town with some big city problems is probably the easiest way I describe it to a lot of people that ask, like, because everyone thinks, Webster, nothing goes on there. And,
it's a sleepy community. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a sleepy Benjamin community. It's far from the case. I was talking to a chief from another South Worcester County agency, and he's like, I'm fully staffed for the first time in however long it's been. And I was like, that must be nice. We currently have a vacancy right now. Again, like I said, trying to get a couple more bodies on. But I laugh at him and I'm like, we don't police the same populations. I'm like, your population that we don't have the same type of policing experience. Yours is a much more suburban experience where I'm dealing with a lot more urban issues here, and my officers are dealing with a lot more urban issues here. And it's a very diverse town as far as not just maybe in cultures, but also in economics. We have one side of the town is almost like a Shrewsbury kind of, and then you have this side of town which is almost like a subsection of Maine South Worcester with the multifamilies and all that, and and with that becomes different. Each one has its unique set of issues, and the officers here have to be able to adapt and deal with those issues. Often in the same shift.
Yeah,
you
right.
deal with the issues on we always joke 395 cuts the town in half.
Exactly. Yep.
The other side of 395 is, they have different expectations and, as far as what they expect the town to be like and what they expect the police to be able to do. And here on this side of 395 is the total opposite. Like they have a different understanding of what it is to be like in Webster, if that makes sense.
It does. And I think I used to, when I was on the school committee a number of years ago, I used to say that Webster is a community it's two communities. It's a town of two sides, or, you used to joke, or the old saying used to be about the train tracks, but I really think it's the 395 is where that split tends to occur. But my observation was that they often those two communities meet in your public schools. Those two communities meet. And I think the same would be true for the police department. Those two communities meet with a level of police engagement and what that engagement looks like, to your point. And I think the ability of your officers to serve those communities, how they serve those communities might be a different dynamic and a different interaction. One of the things that I've always been left with, and I think this is just a personal observation too, is, you're not showing up to someone's house or a motor vehicle stop or some sort of interaction. The chances are it's not that person's best day. And so the interaction with that officer could make the day better, it could make the day worse. And that's going to be dependent upon I hate to say behavior, but sort of the interaction on both sides, and how the officer approaches a situation, and how the individual, or whether it be the motorist or the homeowner, whoever it is, how they approach that officer, and the sort of the lack of civility, or the existence of civility and mutual respect, and sort of those interactions where, I could count on one hand, and it's a privilege to be able to do that, the interactions I've had with police officers throughout my life. And I've had a mixed bag. Some are, because also bear in mind, everybody's entitled to an off day or not a great shift, or, and so if someone approaches my motor vehicle and isn't in the best mood, okay, we both have sort of a role to play in this interaction. I have the respect for the officer and their responsibilities and their job, and also, to be honest, the risk that they're taking in that job. And so, I always sort of was taught growing up that you demonstrate that respect. And but I can also appreciate that in 2025, and I think we all have social media and access to it. Officers have a tough job to do in the field. And so I guess that there's the question I'm sort of trying to get to here is sort of maybe what advice would you have for anybody that has that interaction with an officer in any dynamic, whether it be, again, they call for assistance in some case, or they're pulled over, for some purpose. Like what are your officers looking for in any interaction with a citizen? And how do you train an officer in 2025 for that? Or what expectations should we have for officers that we may encounter in the field, so to speak? Is again, I think the mutual respect is sort of an understanding and sort of a baseline, but are there anything else that we should consider, or that you train your officers to consider?
Well, so as far as like if a citizen has an encounter with the officer, and I understand, and you hit the nail on the head, I always tell people, you're meeting somebody on their worst day. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times that may be the only time they have an interaction with a police officer in their entire life.
Exactly.
And if it's bad, then that's going to be their impression of law enforcement overall, whether they're from Webster or from Boston or from Gloucester, New Hampshire.
Doesn't matter. Right.
That being said, I always tell people, my advice to the public would always be nice. Very simple. Just be polite. Even if you don't agree with arguing on the roadside is never going to go good for either person. All you're going to do is just make a mountain out of a molehill.
And things progress from there, right? Like, I think matters can get worse. And obviously, again, putting the lawyer hat on, like, sort of the meter's running, so to speak. And the more that you can add up a list of or series of charges in that environment. So the goal is to de-escalate on both sides. But again, I think maybe this is what do you look for in, let's say you have some vacancies, sort of you mentioned obviously the demographics of a community and wanting the community policing philosophy. When hiring officers, sort of are there criteria that you look for? Are there particular backgrounds that you try to hire from, and or that would make someone, I hate to say a good police officer, but sort of an ideal candidate, so to speak, as far as folks that you'd be looking to recruit into the Webster PD?
That's great. That's great that you asked this question, because we're actually going through that process right now, because we went through a hiring, we gave a test, and we have the as part of our test, it's a pass-fail. It's given by an outside agency. We had 6 folks take it. Then we do a PT test, which just mimics the evaluation for the assessment to get into a police academy. You have to mimic those standards. So we don't want to hire somebody and then have them not be able to go to the police academy. And it's the baseline is very low, so it's achievable. It's not easy, but it does require some effort. But I'm of the opinion that we're held that we should be able to maintain a physical fitness standard.
Of course.
So once they pass that, one of the things that I look for, and this is the first question I ask if they get to the oral interview, is why do you want to be a Webster police officer? Because I want somebody that wants to work here, because I think Webster is a very unique department. We have a unique relationship with our community. We're very proactive. We're very, I don't want to say, I say aggressive, but I don't mean like physically aggressive. I mean, we go out there and look for bad guys. We go out there and enforce the law, because I think that's how you can prevent a lot of crimes from happening. At the same time, we also want to engage with our community. And I want somebody that has that mindset where they can be both a warrior and a guardian. Like that same officer that wants to go out there and stop cars and be aggressive, doing proactive patrol, but at the same time will volunteer at our community engagement and help out with our basketball program, help out with our junior police academy, have an interaction, give a kid a sticker when you see him out at Honeydew at the coffee shop, or have those. So somebody that's got kind of that both mentality of the warrior and the guardian, and know when to turn that on.
Right, exactly.
I think that's what we look for now. Policing went from, they were like, when I first got started, we were big into the warrior mentality. You go out there, the goon squad would go out there, and we kind of ruled by fear, and that doesn't work.
Right.
That doesn't work. And then we went into the guardian mentality, where we kind of, community policing was a huge thing, and we got away from that warrior mindset. But I think that there's a good officer has both, because there's a time when you have to use both. Both have to come into play. Sometimes you have to be that warrior, and you have to know when to turn that on. If you're responding to a critical incident, you have to get that warrior mindset has to take over. When you're responding to give a death notification, then you got to have the guardian mindset. You got to have a little empathy. So having finding people that have that where biggest thing is that they want to be here. And if they're able to have those 2 virtues, that's a huge part of the piece of the puzzle to come here. Everything else, we have a great training program. So, we would send them to the academy. Then they come in, they do a 12-week training program here with we have like 6 or 8 field training officers that do a fantastic job and mold them into what we want. And then that training obviously continues, because just because you go through the FTO program at 12 weeks doesn't mean you're all set. I mean, this is a job where you continuously learn. But those big things, like I want somebody that wants to be here, not just a lot of guys and girls, when they first get on, they go, I just want to be a cop. I don't care where it is. But they don't have I want somebody that's committed to the town, committed to the department, and for the right reasons, not just because you want to be a police officer and, Webster offered me a job, so I'm going to take it, and then I'm going to leave to go here in 2 years.
Right. Well, you're putting community resources into developing that officer, and obviously you want, in today's day and age too, it's interesting that, law enforcement is one of the remaining careers that people can choose where, I think a lot of people look at their job as simply a job. I work at this place today. But I think law enforcement in a lot of ways has become a career that people stay for the entirety of their career with upward mobility. You become a sergeant, et cetera, or may choose a path down detective bureau or something along those lines. But, I think there's a few professions left in the world where people choose it and pursue it and sort of stay within it. But I want to sort of maybe probe a bit more on the guardian versus warrior, because I think it's really well put. It sort of helps people, I think, sort of appreciate the mindset or even just the psychology of that, but also the ability to flip a switch too. Because like you said, on any given shift, you may have to turn up or turn down either one of those mentalities or one of those mindsets. That takes a certain level of command over one's, mindset and sort of emotions that is not, I wonder, is that something that is that an innate ability? Is that something you can train? Is it both? I just wonder, like, I think about a situation like that sort of fight or flight mentality of like the adrenaline's going and I'm going on a call or something, and just how do you get there? But then also how do you leave that? And also I would say from an officer standpoint, like, how do you not take that home sometimes? Because these are folks with families, yourself included. Like, there's just it's a tough job is sort of the takeaway there. But I'd love to get your thoughts on sort of how someone can turn that up, turn that down, but then also on a moment's notice do that. Where I think again, my interaction with police may be my worst day, but you guys are doing it every day.
Yeah, it's hard. Like, I would say, like, especially when I first started in, like, late 90s, early 2000s, it was all warrior mindset. That's just how we policed. There wasn't a whole lot. We did some community policing, but not like we do now. And it wasn't really until Chief Bent took over that we really kind of embraced that philosophy. And I think for me, that's kind of when the switch happened. I think you can learn it. I think it has to be a philosophy that we all have to embrace and be aware of it. And I don't think a lot of people are, because I think there's been such a focus over the last 5 or 6 years where, law enforcement's been under a ton of scrutiny. And I think officers are somewhat hesitant now, especially with the last 3 or 4 years, some of the rulings from the courts and some of the procedures that we have to follow through the courts. Most recently, we have a new procedure that we have to follow, which is just really the officers are getting disheartened, and it's tough. But it's one of those things. I feel like if you embrace it as a department and have that mindset and know that those expectations there are going to be times when Mike Shaw goes into a call and I'm hopped up on a critical incident, and I may not realize that, hey, now you need to de-escalate. But if my partner next to me says, hey, okay, back off, pulls me out, gives me a little rudder tap, that may be enough to shift it. But if he recognizes it, then he can step in. And we see officers doing that too now, more so than we did years ago. One officer will step in and say, hey, I got this, and deal with somebody, especially like during a booking process where that interaction can go sideways or escalate further. So the officers, it's one of those things that's never like perfect. I don't think I don't know that we ever master it, but we need to be aware of it.
Well, I think at the end of the day, everybody's human. And
yeah, 100%.
Like I said too, we all bring our baggage to any given day. And so if I didn't get enough sleep last night, or if I had if I haven't had my cup of coffee yet, like there might be a certain, you never know what might either tip a scale one direction or the other. But I think the takeaway for me in the sort of the last statement you made was really the teamwork and camaraderie of the job as well, of some, not my partner per se, but like my coworker's ability to recognize a situation and assist me and or the situation by saying, I got it, or hoping that someone else can see me and say, I'll take it from you. Again, if I were in that situation. It reminds me too, I think there's something I've observed in the last few years. I'm glad you sort of highlighted sort of the shift that has occurred culturally and sort of societally in the last few years. And this is not by any means unique to Webster or anywhere else. It's sort of a global environment. Is I think the expectation around where police, you're almost a bellwether and or sort of an early indicator of sorts of some of the societal issues that might rise up into other service, might be the hospital system or the school system around things like mental health and around things like substance use. And, I think we often look to police officers now to be counselors in some way, shape, or form. And the things that your officers confront on a daily basis, again, what you see, what they see in the field might also therefore come up in our healthcare system. They might come up in our school system. They might come up in our, and I think through the wheels of justice and the criminal justice system, they may come up in our prison and our state prisons or sort of the word I'm looking for, our jails. Is that something you've observed as well? And sort of, I guess, generically, your sort of your thoughts on that shifting dynamic of, it once was a job where it was, and I might be, I don't mean to diminish it, but sort of a straightforward, did you break the law, yes or no? Things are far more complex now as far as the diagnosis, perhaps, that officers have to make of which services are best for this individual. Is it they need healthcare, they need assistance, or they need to, sit in the cell for a little bit and cool off? And so I guess how that decision or that observation, sort of that confrontation, how much has that changed in, say, the last 5 to 10 years?
It's so, I wish we could go back to just like, did you break the law? Yes or no?
Yeah.
It was so much easier. Like, so that's one thing when I first started, it was just, you get to be cops, and I don't want to say that it's not fun now, but it was just like, you go out there and just chase bad guys. And that was what we did. But now, like, it's changed, especially the last, 5, 10 years. People call the police for everything.
Sure.
Everything.
Right.
My 6-year-old won't go to school. Well, I'll call the cops. I'll make the cops be the bad guy. Talk to my kids about drugs. We get more calls for Section 12s for people that are
Mm-hmm.
having mental health issues, substance use issues, Section 35s from the court, and just mental health calls. The amount of mental health issues that we deal with that on a regular basis, just in regular calls for service, and I hate to use the word regular, but it's astronomical. And what we ask of our police officers, not just in Webster, but nationwide, they're asked to be teachers, counselors, psychologists, you name it. And then you want them to, and they have to deal with all this stuff, and there's no help. And there's fortunately with Webster, like we have a community outreach advocate that we brought on a couple of years ago, which was, unheard of to have our own. A lot of departments are doing grants and sharing them with other departments, but my thought was Webster needs their own. Like I'm like I said, I'm an only child. I don't share with anybody, so I don't want to share with other communities. Webster needs their own, because I think the need is here for that.
But also based on
the
volume.
need is absolutely
exactly.
here for that,
Right.
and it's not fair to anybody else to share that need. But it's very frustrating because, we'll Section 12 somebody, which is if somebody is having thoughts of hurting themselves or others, the officers have the ability to fill out a form and they can go up to the hospital and be screened. 9 times out of 10, that person's out of the hospital before the officer's off their shift, and they're dealing with them again a week later and again. And it seems like the systems are broken. And it's frustrating, and it's really, really, it can be a lot. We ask a lot of our police to do above and beyond. Like I guarantee if I went down and asked everybody working here, if we could take the mental health aspects of the calls out of what you do as part of your daily duties, and you could just do law enforcement stuff and investigate crimes and go look for bad guys, how much would that improve your job? And I guarantee you they would all be like 100,000%. But it's hard because it's challenging, because we didn't get into this job to be counselors. Yes, does that happen from time to time? Absolutely. Do we do a good job at de-escalating? Absolutely. These guys and girls do a phenomenal job based on, and there have been more and more trainings for this, but the role of a police officer is so much more now than it was 10 years ago. And it's just continuing to evolve. But at some point, like, how much more can you ask of them to do? It just gets to be so much. And at the same time, crimes are still being committed.
Exactly.
Like that's still going on. And so, but we're taking all this time to deal with the mental health issues that are going on, and there's no services for these folks to get checked, to get help. There's no, the substance use issues. There's not a ton of services around here for that. Everything is that's just always out here, and people are still committing crimes over here. So we're not be able to give these folks over here that are committing the crimes the attention that they deserve because we've got to deal with this. So it's just it's almost like a conundrum of, what are we doing? It gets very overwhelming at times, and
Sure.
it's frustrating. It's very, very
overwhelms
frustrating.
a broader system as well, which is, like you said, if you're bringing folks to the hospital to be screened and they're being released, the emergency rooms are also crowded. Then you think about, do you put it into the justice system? And again, that system is overwhelmed and also is very, I'd like to say, it's not that it's inhumane. It's just, it's very, it's sort of a paperwork system in some ways. And it lacks that sort of, it's not a service per se. And that's why I think, is there a model that you've seen or that you're aware of that is sort of a gold standard or a best practice where, like, because the other thing I'm thinking about too is, it's not as if the expectations of officers have changed or our police force has changed, but the resources available has not dramatically changed. The training is you're still trained to be police officers, not counselors, and so the things all the things around that system have not caught up to it to make it an ideal system. And also you've got to, I think about judges, for instance, again, back to the sort of the lawyer dynamic where, once you become a judge, you sort of stop making new friends in some ways. You stop learning some of the new laws, not new laws, but some of the new technology might be, because it's just, you have one job and you do it, and sort of you not punch a clock, but you sort of, the wheels turn. And I think about sort of like admitting evidence and sort of expert testimony and all these things where judges sort of go into a shell, and they're not always exposed to sort of culturally new things, and someone stands before them, you either committed the crime or you didn't, and the jury said yes or no, or my decision on the bench is XYZ. I just think about the resources catching up with your existing officers as well as your new officers. Sort of like if they change the curriculum in the academy today, it's not like the person who's been on the job for 20 years is going back to the academy. So you do in-service training, sure, but is it sufficient enough to say your job has dramatically changed overnight? My expectations for you have dramatically changed overnight. So zebra, change your stripes. That's just not how the world works. So I guess I think about people committing crimes. Behind that crime might be a mental health episode, or might be a substance use relapse, perhaps, or desperation relative to substance use, etc. Is there again, it's sort of a maybe a loaded question, maybe not even a fair question, but is there a system, a better way to handle it that maybe includes law enforcement, but it doesn't exclusively include law enforcement? Like you said, you have some in-house resources, but I just wonder, like, if you could reinvent the system, would you? Or I don't know. I guess I'm not really sure what I'm asking outside of, is there a better way to handle situations like that?
I think in some cases, yeah. Like I always loved when Dudley used to have the drug court.
Yes, sure.
Judge Bebo used to run the drug court up there, and they got away from it. Other courts still do it. Dudley doesn't for whatever reason. I don't know why. But I thought that was always a good alternative because, yes, you're absolutely right. Drugs are, I went to a class and the instructor said, drugs are the center of the criminal universe. And I agree, 100%. And I think that's an underlying, you take drugs and alcohol away and our job would probably drop, dramatically, our responses. But, so that's obviously, we need to fix the underlying cause for a lot of things, for a lot of problems.
Right.
And that's them. I thought the drug court, some of those alternative programs out there are good. Obviously, they're only as good as if somebody doesn't want help, then it's not going to help them. I mean, that's right. The one thing I've learned is, you can't just force somebody to go to rehab. You can't drop them off at AdCare and think they're going to get better. But I think sometimes on the second, third, fourth try is when it takes. And that's what I relay that to my officers. When I was involved with the Opening the Word Recovery Center, and we were doing what started all this with the co-response models, when I had recovery coaches and social workers coming out here. We would go do follow-ups after folks overdosed or had some kind of interaction with the police and there was a substance use issue there. We saw some decent results from that, and we still do. Like, we still do see some good positive results from Jen's interactions with folks, and having her here is definitely better than not having her here. I think that's a step, but I think that having the resources to refer folks to, whatever those could be, I think would be beneficial. I feel like there's just a lack of them here.
Yeah, that's fair.
And I think that's one of the problems about like Webster being where it's located. We don't get a lot of the services that they do in, say, Worcester or some of the bigger areas in the Metro West. We just don't have folks here don't have access to those services. So it's not always something that is available. So they don't get the help.
And that's a good example of sort of back to the point we made earlier, where you have a lot of the issues of a city, but I hate, the urban sort of issues that someone might expect, but you also have that sort of suburban setting. And, we think about Worcester as being close by, but it's not necessarily accessible to a lot of people. We don't have public transportation to the same extent that they would in, Worcester or Boston or, and I think it might as well be a different country for some people as far as how inaccessible it is. But for us, it's a 15-minute drive. Well, don't have access to a vehicle, don't have a driver's license, all those things, don't have a ride. Now I've got to wait for a bus that has, doesn't come as often as you would hope. And so I think for a lot of folks, it's a world away. And if those resources aren't literally downtown, then they're just not accessible. And if they're not supported with funding and personnel and consistent funding as well, because, back when I worked in the State House, that was always a chronic issue, was how do you not just get funding, but every year it's a fight to preserve it, or it's a fight to meet cost of living, or sort of just the cost of living of a contract. And so a center might be open for 6 months to a year, but then if it closes, there's no lasting impact of that. And we pilot, we experiment with a lot of things, but these are people's lives. These are people's well-being and quality of life. So it's tough to have the resource and then pull the rug out from under them as well. And that doesn't bode well for anybody. Again, where we're going to see that is with law enforcement interactions most often. Yeah.
And a lot of people don't want to leave Webster. Like, a lot of people don't want to go to the city. They want to stay here. They're not comfortable leaving what they know. And we tried when we tried the Opening the Word, we opened that during COVID in 2020. We just had to close it, unfortunately, in 2024 due to lack of, we couldn't staff it. All our funding was basically either donations or fundraising. We had some very generous donations, but we weren't able to open for regular hours. It was kind of just when the programs were there. So I feel like we missed a lot of people because we weren't able to target the walk-in population. Which is really what my hope was when we started that, with Pastor Janice, was to try to have a place where folks could drop in, and you might catch those one or two people that need help and looking for help, and that's the day that they decided to get clean, and
that's
they want to go there.
And there's no rhyme or reason for why today's that day, but you want to be there when that person makes that decision, and that's a small window.
It
right?
is.
You think about human nature. You think about the psychology of such a moment of clarity to say, today's the day, now's the time. And then you go and the door's locked and you think, there's my sign. It's not meant to be. And I think that's a sad reality. And again, I think my expectation of law enforcement has never been that officers are those counselors, but you are in some ways sort of not the gatekeeper, but it's an access point and I think it's like the fork in the road moment, right? Of, if I put this in the system, you go down a path of justice and sort of enforcement, but what you really need is support and services. And that fork in the road moment, I almost think of an officer as almost a guiding hand in that situation to say, here's the path we want to put you on. And more often than not, officers would want the good nature and sort of the good faith is to assist, to assist in that moment. And the assist is, we'd love to provide you those resources. They're just not available. But alternatively, therefore, it's no longer a fork in the road. It's a one-way street. And I think that's it's a sad reality of some of those interactions, and also how things lead to, again, like you said, if sort of drugs and alcohol are at the root of all of those things, it's a root cause of something, and you're treating oftentimes the symptom of it, which is the desperation related to it, or frankly, just the impairment of things. We don't make good decisions, and we don't always make good decisions, perhaps, but yeah, I think that's again, I appreciate the effort you put in personally into pursuing some of those resources, as far as making the connections and serving as a community leader. As far as, I think your support speaks volumes to motivating others to get involved as well. And so I know that's not lost on you. And again, I think your status in our community as being a voice of reason, but being a voice of maturity to say, I just, again, the optics of that are powerful. Of, we as law enforcement want to stand behind our residents, our citizens, and provide them services, because we know that the alternative is they sort of just become they get put into a machine, and that machine keeps turning, and sadly that follows you too. So I guess on the flipping the topic a little bit, but zooming further and further out a little bit too, one issue I know police officers have had to encounter as of late is sort of that sort of new accountability standards, right? So you have new agencies being developed. Again, this is a phenomenon across the country, not just here in Webster, not just here in Massachusetts, but Massachusetts has specifically looked at things like police officer accountability, and some of that is department by department, as far as an officer's history, and sort of you think about like your record, your personnel file following you everywhere you might go. How has Webster handled that? And I don't know if folks might not be aware, as far as our listeners are concerned, but there's sort of a new agency called the Police Officer Standards and Training Post.
Yep.
It's a commission that is really like a statewide repository of sorts, but also certifies officers now. And so there's certain criteria in addition to you mentioned like the academy and things, but officers have to be certified to serve. And that certification is something that would follow you. So you mentioned if an officer starts in Webster but transfers to another department, or if Webster transfers someone in from another department, that sort of central repository would be that information. How is Webster engaged in that effort? And I guess, how do you strike a balance between that new accountability standard, which, to be honest, it can hover over somebody and sort of hover over a department or an individual officer, and how do you balance that with officer morale and motivation, and sort of, you think about rallying the troops, so to speak. How do you do both of those things at once?
Yeah. So the one of the good things that we've always done is we've held our officers accountable. So when the post came into effect, it wasn't a huge change, other than the fact that if you had some issues on in your personnel file, some internal affairs reports that were sustained, and they went to post, they were reported, so they're on the public database. So that's obviously, for some officers, it was, it's could be, I guess, it's a little disheartening or embarrassing, but it is what it is. It's all public record, so somebody could find it if they wanted to prior, I guess, with the new public records law. But so we obviously we complied, but we've always held that standard prior to post, so it wasn't really a huge change. But we always just tell, like Deputy Chief Wentworth always says, all you have to do to be a successful police officer is just do the right thing, and you won't have anything to worry about. And we're not perfect. Cops aren't perfect. If somebody files a complaint, we absolutely investigate it, and if somebody needs to be disciplined, we'll do that. That's probably the worst part of this job, but I mean, for the most part, I think that the officers here do a great job. And do we have a few people that have made some mistakes? Yep, we have, but we get up, dust off, and move on. And
yeah, the piece of the deputy chief's advice, I think, is sound. I think what the public may not appreciate about that, though, is doing the right thing in a split second, or doing the right thing based on your own best judgment versus what the benefit of hindsight plus a comprehensive review might judge. And I think that's sometimes where that accountability can be used as a hammer, and it can also be used as an opportunity. And the dynamic is different sometimes, right? Like you think about what's a teachable moment. And I think the teachable moment in the life of a police officer, there's the thing of there's honest mistakes and there's dishonest mistakes, maybe.
Yeah.
I guess my takeaway
mistakes.
is ultimately it's easy for us to sit in judgment of a split-second decision when we didn't have to make that split-second decision sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, I think probably the most obvious thing is use of force.
Exactly. Right.
Use of force never looks pretty, never looks good, no matter how slight or it is. Anytime an officer has to put their hands on, take someone to the ground, it looks bad. And especially when we see it in social media or we see it on the news,
Exactly.
we only see the snippet of the actual force. We don't see what leads up into that. And a lot of times, officers will make a decision, and there's a lot of other circumstances that the public isn't aware of, and they may not be, because they're not trained to look for certain things. So officers will react. There's certain indicators that they'll look at where someone's, call it a pre-attack indicator, where someone's sizing them up, clenching their fists, pacing, different statements, history, time of day, where they are, all those things. Like all those things come into play, and officers have to make, like you said perfectly, a split-second decision, and it just never looks good. So when we look at it, and then the public gets upset when we use force, and then it comes out later that the officer was cleared. Well, this is why he was cleared, because of all these other things that I just referred to. And that's all part of the overall investigation. But, I think that's where credibility comes into play as well as a department. Webster Police, we're not going out and thumping people and beating the public up. So, but we had an arrest maybe a couple months ago, and we posted it. We posted it on our Facebook page, and some family members went in there and said, "Oh, he was, there was allegations of use of force." They came in and filed a complaint. Deputy Chief reviewed it, submitted it to me. There was no excessive force. It's all on body camera, so we released the body camera footage.
Right.
Here it is, and this is why. And I feel like it refuted every allegation they made. But had we not had those body camera footage, or had we not made that post, it would just be out here lingering in social media land. Oh, the Webster Police beat up a 62-year-old man, which is not the case.
Yeah, but I think it sort of leads to two questions. One is because that's the sort of not the case I was thinking of, but those are the sort of the examples that come to mind when I think about the split-second decisions. It also speaks to your earlier comment relative to the warrior and guardian mentality and how quickly someone might have to shift that. Because obviously if there's folks with cell phones all around, like the officer's thinking, I have to protect everybody in this situation, including the person that's filming it, as far as they're close enough to the situation to be within camera shot of it. And so if things escalate quickly, like I have an obligation to this environment right here, myself as well, my fellow officers, but also everybody that's sort of around the situation. And so that decision to say, and like you said, sort of as much as someone else might be sizing the officer up, the officer's sizing up that entire room and wondering, is this going to get out of hand? How quickly can this get out of hand? What other things, like you said, time of day, history with the individual, with the sort of environment, all these things are racing through their head, and they've got to make that split-second decision. And they know in the back of their mind, this is going to get evaluated 10 times over, either formally through that accountability measures that are now in place, or on social media without the benefit of the full story, et cetera. So how do you, in making that decision to release the body camera footage, which I actually respect the hell out of the fact that you did it, because I do think it tells a full story. And that's also where I think sometimes people assume that officers don't like body cameras, when in reality, it's the record, right? Like it protects everybody in that situation, including the officer. But how do you make the decision to say, you know what, on this situation, I have to set the record straight. I'm going to release the body camera footage. versus, you know what, it's for the safety or the privacy. There's a lot of reasons why someone wouldn't or shouldn't. But there's also, I think, a really compelling reasons why you should and why you did. I guess, what's your mindset when thinking about whether or not to do that? And I'd love to come back to talk about things like technology a little bit more too, just because I do think it's changed the job quite a bit, I'm sure.
Yeah. In this particular case, they had created a Facebook page.
Okay.
Essentially, Webster Police Department is beats people up. I'm paraphrasing, but they created an anti-Webster Police Department Facebook page and alleging that we are thugs and used excessive force. So normally, if there's a few comments there, it is what it is. You know, we'll leave the comments on our page. We don't delete them because we can't. But because they had gone the extra step, and I've had cases in the past where people have sent things to the media, and the media will come and look for, it was a few years ago, but they came to me regarding an incident. And we didn't have body cameras back then, but in this particular instance, it was totally incorrect. So I wanted to set the record straight before it started to grow legs, because social media is a great thing, but can also be a very bad thing as well, because the wrong people get a hold of it. Things can go viral, as we all know. And, then that opens up a whole nother set of problems that you have to deal with. Years ago, we had an incident where officers were at an apartment and they were arresting somebody, and one of the suspects had jumped on one of my officers. It was on top of him, and the other officer thought he was trying to grab his gun, so he hit him with a flashlight. So somebody with a cell phone had recorded it, and all I saw was the officer hitting with a flashlight. So NECN came to me looking for a statement, and they almost wanted like the aha, gotcha moment.
Yeah, defend yourself.
And I said, well, let me explain to you why this is what happened, and broke it down for them. When it actually turned out to be a very good piece. At the end, I was like, well, how about we just don't fight with the police, and then we all lesson learned. Never, nobody gets hit with anything.
Yeah, it's sort of like words to live by, I suppose. I guess, but on that front, as far as the advent of body cameras, the introduction of body cameras, we talked about drones earlier. I guess those tools, we'll call them tools, do they bring challenges as well, as far as, because we think about, it's nice to have that full record. It's good to have, these things recorded in the event that things go sideways. But also, I have to imagine that it does take away sort of the, if you and I are having a conversation, you and I are having a conversation, but because we hit record on this, everybody else is going to get to potentially see it and hear it. And in this instance, I want that. I want people to be able to sort of hear this conversation, but it sort of takes away the privacy of the interaction as well. And so I guess as much as we embrace technology and see it as the tool that it absolutely is, do they present challenges to a smaller department like Webster's, or does the size matter in that instance? Is it really more of just it is what it is, and sort of welcome to 2025, deal with it?
Yeah. So in regards to the body camera piece, I firmly believe that body cameras were coming, and I was a very anti-camera guy early on, because I thought, didn't know a whole lot about them. And then the last few years kind of changed my thinking on that, and the grants came around. I was like, well, you know what, we're all going to have to go to them anyway. So let's apply for the grant and see where it goes. I mean, I know it's not an issue for our people. Our people aren't doing anything nefarious out there, so I wasn't worried about it. To be honest, they have embraced it, and they actually like it, because it shows people, it gives them the ability to show people in how they're acting with a camera on video, as opposed to just a report. So now they can just press play. Well, no, it's one thing to read that a person was acting a certain way and yelling and screaming and waving their arms, but then when you put it on camera and you press play and you watch it, you get a much better perspective of what the officer is dealing with. So that is a good thing. It's, one of the negative things is, it does take that privacy away when you're on a call, a prolonged call. The officers do have the ability to mute the camera if they're having a private conversation or they want to talk about something that they don't want on there. They just have to articulate that they're muting on the camera and then unmute it. But the camera's always on, so it's always recording in the background, not audio, but it's always recording video. So, but I think the biggest thing that we're going to see with the cameras, one of the biggest problems that we're having, and this doesn't really affect the patrol side, but it's the public record side. To create a public record for a camera, if someone does a public record request, it takes a lot of time. It probably takes, for a 15-minute video, it's probably going to take about 4 or 5 hours for the redaction. In the store, like Webster went with cloud storage, so we don't have physical servers in the station, but that's a cost. So that's expensive. We're switching over to our cruiser cameras are going to go to cloud storage, so that's also going to be an expense. But we're trying to get away from that rack system storage, because eventually we're going to run out of space to have
right.
all that physical storage, because we have all this other computer equipment that we have to have. So financially, it's a bit of a challenge, especially for a smaller town. But it's one of those things that I'd rather have it than not have it. There's still quite a few agencies that don't have body cameras yet, and I think they're coming eventually. I think it's a great thing for our folks. And we're a younger department now, because we've had some turnover in the last 5 to 10 years. So they're all used to with the cameras and being recorded and all that. So wasn't really a big thing. They were asking for it prior to us getting them, some of them. Some of the older officers were a little skeptical, but I think that it hasn't, knock on wood, it hasn't hurt anybody yet. And it's actually, right. I like to utilize it via the social media to show what we deal with, because I think it's important. Like I said to you in the beginning, like a lot of Webster has no idea what goes on, what our officers deal with. A lot of folks, because they don't have that interaction with us, or they just don't have the knowledge of the town like we do. So I think it's a good way for us to share kind of what we deal with. We just started a drone unit, so we were able to use some of our drug asset forfeiture funds to purchase a drone, which is a great tool. Some of the detractor on that, now we have a cruiser that's dedicated to that. We have 3 officers that are trained in it. But, there's training, there's maintenance, there's costs that go along with that. But it's a good asset to have. We've used it a couple of times in searches, and it also helps us in mapping out accident crashes. We're part of the Semlec Recon drone unit, rather. So they go out and help other agencies that maybe don't have drone, or they need more than one. So it's a great asset to have. It supplements our canines if they're doing searches, our SWAT teams if they're doing tactical entries. The uses for it are unlimited. We bought a smaller one that we could actually utilize if the fire department needed to go and check out like a chemical leak in a house. We could send the drone in to go try to find the source of that. So it's some pretty high speed stuff, which I never thought we'd be doing. But here we are in 2025 doing that. But it's definitely, there's also that brings some challenges as far as rights to privacy, are the police spying on us? There's a trust issue there. I've seen that. We haven't had to deal with that here in Webster, at least not yet, but I have seen that issue raised in various other communities locally and nationwide.
Well, and I have to imagine the balance is where I think, especially in your specific role, that's something that you've got to consider and you've got to maintain sort of a vigilance on, which is what level of transparency is appropriate and helpful to say, this is what we now have, this technology, this is what we're using it for. And I think because you've been so engaged and you've been so active in social media and you've been so public, there is a trust, an inherent trust built into that. Whereas if someone discovered that, they have a drone now, and now it's like, then the whispers start, right? So I think the more proactive you've been, but also I think the fact that you've used the body camera footage to display that these are the facts, this is the image, reach your own conclusions versus what you might hear from one side or the other. Like, because again, your officer is going to have a perspective on the interaction, so too is the individual that the interaction was with. The body camera footage is just the record. This is what happened. It's objective. And I think the same is true, again, for the introduction of some of the technologies where citizens and others may look at it and think, well, if I didn't have the context from the chief, or if I didn't know that the chief was being out front about having this information or having this enhanced technology and the purpose that it was actually purchased for, I think the whispers and sort of the trust might not be there. But I think because of the way you've conducted yourself as chief, The trust is sort of inherently baked into that. And I guess we're sort of up on time. I want to just maybe close with a final, maybe broader question here, which is, we've talked about sort of your origins here in the department and your tenure. And again, thank you for your career, and also thank you to your service to me and my family. And as we've been citizens of Webster for so long, and you've been sort of a loyal police officer in our community for your career, and we are grateful and lucky to have had that service. As you look forward, maybe the next 5 to 10 years, what are we going to be talking about in 5 to 10 years? What do you have a sense of sort of the challenges the department might see, or law enforcement generally might see, but also how are you getting ready for the next 5 to 10 years? How do you look forward? How do you predict a very uncertain and perhaps murky future as far as law enforcement and policing?
So locally, we're trying to up our numbers and trying to get our I would say we're currently staffed at 33 officers. We need to be around 40, honestly. Obviously, that's a big nut for the town to budget for us. So, and obviously being aware of that, we have asked for 2 for next year. I'm hopeful that goes, but that's my first priority, is to try to get those numbers built up. Second is I think the investigative aspect of police work is going to become much more expansive. I think that there's going to be a lot more reliance upon investigations through the detectives. Like, a lot of investigations that even the patrol officers are dealing with now are very complicated. Like, with the advent of some of the cybersecurity and the fraud that goes on, it's a lot more than just, somebody writing bad checks. Like when I was a detective, it's a lot. It's with the internet and cryptocurrency and the scams that go on. It's a lot more. It's a lot harder to investigate, and it's a lot more time. So I think that's going to be, you're going to see speaking of technology, you're going to see that become much more prevalent in law enforcement, looking for folks or having that niche where they can, navigate some of those complicated investigations. And I also think, I do think that things will come, officers right now are feeling like there's almost like and I think this is true for anybody in authority, almost like a lack of respect for law enforcement, whether you're a teacher, nurses, just people that are in authority. I feel like some of the values have kind of broken down there. I think that's going to come full circle at some point. I'm hopeful in the next 5 or 10 years. I always, I remember after the Boston bombing, it was great. When we came back from Watertown there, and it was good. We had those same feelings after 9/11. Everybody was, pro law enforcement, and then, 20 minutes later, it was back to the way it was. I'm hopeful that things change and we kind of get that respect back to where it was, maybe 20 years ago, where, if you had an interaction with the police officers, it wasn't always a negative one. It was a good one. And, there was respect shown by the kids and by adults, and the kids learned from the adults. So I think that's what I am hopeful to see. As far as Webster goes, I think Webster's going to be, I hopeful that the partnerships that we have continue to grow with the town. I just had a conversation with a couple of the selectmen, and we were just talking about, we are the first call for everybody in town here, whether it's your water is shut off, like I said, your kids, your basement's flooding, your kid won't go to school, you need your air conditioner put in, whatever it is, people will call the police for it, believe it or not.
Yeah.
And I think that's gonna continue. But I also think when I first took over as chief, my long-term goal was to make better a Webster place. And to do that, I had a series of short-term goals that I've been meeting. But the long-term goal, hopefully, is going to be continued on for the next administration, which I'm certain it will. But that's going to take a collaboration of a lot of other people to do that. I think that Webster has to have a paradigm shift. And this is kind of, big picture looking as far as what do we want Webster to be? Do we want to continue to have, 4,000 gas stations and all these multi-family houses with absentee landlords, or do we want to try to hold them responsible and give people a good place to grow up and have a good community here where folks can, thrive and do well? That makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's, it brings us back home, which is sort of the purpose of doing projects like this, which is really to highlight some of there's plenty good happening here in town. There's plenty good happening here in this region. And I think depending on where you get your information or sort of where you spend your time, you may not see it. You may not have visibility into it. And so that's, why I started this project in particular, was to try to bring some attention to some of the good that's happening in this area, but to try to bring some attention to the people that are doing that good as well. And again, that's why I asked you to join me today, is because you've been one of those people for a long time that's been doing that good, both as a patrolman and obviously throughout your career now as chief. And I think that's, if we had more of you and more of the folks like you, but also if we got folks to listen to you and some of your ideas and some of the objectives and some of the short-term goals that you've had, I think there'd be a lot more good happening, but we'd have a lot more support behind that good as well, and a lot more acknowledgement of that good. And so certainly want to thank you for spending some time with me today, for joining me. I'd love to have you back at some point and talk about some of those other short-term projects, talk about things like how do you police a lake, and also maybe talk about that Boston Marathon history, because again, there's so much more throughout your career, but also in your job that you do and you see every day that I think people would either be shocked to learn, but also appreciative of, just as far as the good that does go on. So again, my thanks to you personally, and really have enjoyed our conversation. And again, we covered a lot of territory, but the takeaway is pretty simple, which is that mutual respect you show an officer, and be nice to people, and also respect that officers have to flip a switch sometimes and go from that guardian to that warrior mentality. And how they do it is because they're well trained, because we support them as a community. And if we intend to have a good, productive interaction, we know that the police will meet us at that same mentality. So again, my thanks to you, Chief, and look forward to having you back on someday.
Sounds good. Thank you very much for having me.